To give a huge shout out to my colleague Maritza Serlos. She's somewhere here. She worked so hard to put everything that you see here together. So shout out to Maritza. I want to acknowledge someone in the audience. She's the founder of the San Antonio Book Festival, and our outgoing board chair, Katie Flato, is in the audience. And one more thing that this team is really hard at work on. Next year's 2022 San Antonio Book Festival. Next year we turn 10, and we cannot wait to be back at the Central Library and the Southwest School of Art. So mark your calendars for May 21st. Cross all your fingers, all your legs, all your toes, cross your neck, that we get to be in person. I am honored to introduce and welcome tonight's special guests. Unless you have been hiding under a rock, and maybe you have, I wouldn't blame you. You have probably heard about this book, Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth. It made headlines this summer, which I will not go into, but the gist of it is this. These authors dared to challenge the narrative that we have all been taught about the Alamo, to talk about the contributions of Tejanos in that important piece of Texas history, and cancel culture tried to come for them. Of course, readers responded by making the book a New York Times bestseller. We are so proud to stand with readers and feature this book tonight. At the San Antonio Book Festival, we welcome dialogue and respectful conversation. There will be some time after the presentation for audience questions. No matter which side of the conversation that you stand on, we ask that you follow our code of conduct. Our code of conduct, which is basically this: kindness is the rule. We encourage you to buy your copy, an early Christmas gift from our bookseller, Nowhere Bookshop, and get it signed after the talk. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the authors behind Forget the Alamo. Bryan Burrough is the author of 6 books, including The Big Rich, Days of Rage, Public Enemies, and the #1 New York Times bestseller, Barbarians at the Gate. Chris, who is on his way, he's stuck in traffic. He's a columnist for the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News, and the author of the New York Times best-selling Tomlinson Hill, about his family's slave-owning history in Texas. From 1995 to 2007, he reported for more than 30 countries and 9 wars for the Associated Press. Jason Stanford is a writer whose bylines have appeared in Texas Monthly, the Austin American Statesman, the LA Times, MSNBC, Texas Tribune, Texas Highways. The former communications director for Austin Mayor Steve Adler, Jason previously worked as a political consultant and now serves as chief of communications and community engagement for Austin ISD. He also publishes a weekly Substack newsletter called The Experiment. And our moderator, Dr. Sarah Zenaida Gould, will be moderating tonight's conversation. Sarah is executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, headquartered here in San Antonio, a project to collect and disseminate Mexican American civil rights history. A longtime public historian, she has curated over a dozen exhibits on history, art, and culture, and was formerly founding director of the Museo del West Side and lead curatorial researcher at the Institute of Texan Cultures. She received a BA in American Studies from Smith College and an MA and PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan. Please help me welcome Dr. Sarah Zenaida Gould and the authors of Forget the Alamo, Bryan Burrough, Jason Stanford, and very soon, Chris Tomlinson.
Wow.
Good evening, everyone. How exciting to be in person with you tonight, especially with these authors. This book has been getting so much attention. So I want to say, if you haven't had a chance, of course, you can buy it over there. But how many of you have read it, maybe part of it? Oh, great. You've got a bunch of. Okay, so you're going to.
So we don't have to explain a lot of stuff.
And you're going to have well-informed questions for the audience Q&A. Okay, one of the things that I think is so great about this book is that you cover a lot of ground, but you I mean, there have been so many publications on the Alamo, and so you give us this nice overview of all the way going back to early Spanish Texas times to today, so a lot of ground. But you present it in such an engaging and humorous way. And so the first question is just how did this book come about? Had it been an idea that you had been percolating for a long time, or was it something that was inspired by more recent events?
You were told for it.
Well, first, let me just say, no BS. That it's kind of an honor to be on the dais with you because we are interlopers and visitors on turf that you live on. We're fully aware that what we wrote in this book is three middle-aged Anglo guys are probably not the ideal messengers for this, but we started the darn book and felt like somebody had to say some of these things about race and ethnicity. And we kind of took a deep breath and asked some Tejano academics and friends, were we going to be okay? We ran it by the right people, and we survived. The book basically was Chris's idea. Chris is a well-read and very popular columnist for the Houston San Antonio paper. And we were having breakfast one morning on South Congress in Austin, near where Chris and I live. And he was telling us about a column he was writing about selling the Alamo brand. And as part of that, he was doing some research. He said, "You wouldn't believe how much stuff about the Alamo you're told. It's just not true." And we were like, he was eating his migas and I was, drinking my coffee. We were kind of half listening. And then he said, and I remember what literally caused me to jolt up was he said, "I can prove to you that the conventional Alamo legend has been used to oppress and suppress generations of Tejanos culturally." And I was like, wow, if you can prove that. And then he went on a jag. He had done his research. He knew it all. And as we say in the acknowledgments, for those of you who have gotten to the end of the book, that was when I famously among the three of us, slammed my hand down on the table and said, "That's a fucking book." And that was on a Sunday morning. And by Wednesday at 5 p.m., we had a book deal. Thanks to I have a very nice publisher. But, we didn't go into this thinking for political reasons. We went into this as an historical curiosity that here is this legend that has held up for 180 odd years, and yet so much of it does not stand up to the historical record. It's just not there. So I appreciate the kind words, and Jason will say something in a second. I appreciate your kind words about the tone, because to us, the tone was almost everything. We knew, based on kind of our views that evolved, that if we came in here as preachy or somehow snarky journalists or woke lefty people, trying to tell Texans that they're just wrong, that nobody's going to listen to that. We felt like the word I kept using from the beginning was this had to be a friendly book. It has to be okay for you to believe what you want to believe. But if you're going to believe something that's different, at least let me show you some fresh new ideas. And I will say that people seem to have reacted in a kind way to that.
My background's in politics, which is why a lot of people think there's a political agenda behind this book. I can assure you it wasn't. I was under the mistaken assumption that writing a book with my friends would be fun. It was not. But one thing that drives me nuts about politics is the typical liberal rhetorical posture is, please sit still while I explain to you why you're wrong, and conversely, why I'm right. Weirdly, that hasn't been working for Democrats. Weirdly, they keep doing it. We didn't want to write this book as a jury made against people who are wrong. We wanted to invite people into the facts and just tell a compelling story, because the only way to get rid of a bad story, an inaccurate story, or a damaging story, which is what we think the Alamo myth has been for many people, is to tell a more compelling story. And Bryan, who's largely responsible for retelling the history of the events, I think did a great job of that.
What?
I just wanted to make sure you didn't have a follow-up.
Oh, you'll never shut either one of us up, so just keep going.
Okay. So right off the bat, page 3, you tell us At its roots, the Texas Revolt was about money, how Texas made it, and why the Mexican government objected. Fast forward a few sentences. As hard as it may be to accept, Texas as we know it exists only because of slave labor. So, page 3, cat's out of the bag. That's where this story is going. The book has made a lot of people upset, but can you just kind of, explain, you didn't just come up with this idea. You did a bunch of research and you found a lot of evidence. So why should we know that in fact, and why should we believe this claim that in fact Texas was one of the most militant sort of slave places in the nation?
Well, there's only a finite number of independent slave-based countries in the 19th century. There's like 6 constitutions you can go read. And I think Chris read most of them and said, dude, Texas is way to the right, even of the Confederacy. But the overall question is about slavery, how we had the confidence to come out and say it. Let's put our cards on the table here. Other than the frankly awesome section on Phil Collins at the end of the book, much of this book is not new.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The much of this book parrots, summarizes, and tries to introduce to the mainstream public ideas that have been researched and embraced by mainstream academics over the last 50 years. That's what a popular history like ours does typically, is it summarizes academic work and presents it to people who don't have time to go read academic work. So, as we chart in the book, slavery was an issue that until the 1990s, academics had pretty much tiptoed around. And then in the 90s and the 2000s, several plunged in, and I think make a very compelling reason for the reasons that we cite in the book, that slavery, nobody went and picked up a gun at the last minute because somebody was taking their slaves. What we argue is that the underlying cause, the thing that drove people apart, clearly was slavery. I mean, it was the only thing that they were arguing about for most of those 15 years. And then, yes, when it happened, in the moment, it was also about slavery because people believed Santa Anna was coming in, as he was, to free the slaves. So the first 3 chapters of the book, which, as Jason mentioned, were mine. This is, if you want to drill down into the stuff, the book, one of the rabbis for this book, a guy whose book I read and then went, holy shit, and called him up and said, dude, you have got to tell me everything. Is this, Douglas, what's his name at North Texas? I'm drawing a total blank on his last name. The book is called Seeds of Empire. And it was a book that came out in 2015. This fella is at North Texas. He's mentioned in the book. In fact, we say that the first 3 chapters are heavily reliant on him. And his book is an economic analysis of the cotton economy in the South and Texas, and how it led, the fluctuations in the cotton economy led to the revolt. And it is a game changer if you talk to the 18 or 180 people in academia who've read it. It has not largely sunk into the public parks of San Antonio. I saw it, we saw it, and we're like, oh, wow, we can really run with this argument. And so I called Doug and I'm like, you okay if we run with the argument? He said, if you give us credit. And so we ran with it. It's important new scholarship.
So let me piggyback on that. One thing that I wasn't able to get in the book was in the chapter about doing the textbooks for 7th grade. Stephen Cure, who I think is one of the great heroes of this book, he talked about how the working group that was in charge of synthesizing the research to get at the standards for 7th graders, they'd read Seeds of Empire. They all knew about this. They also knew they could never get it past the State Board of Education. They knew that politicians would never allow kids to be taught what they knew was historical fact, which is kind of a problem when you're talking about a history book. Why should we be talking about history? I mean, slavery, it's because we really don't have a problem in our country. As contentious as the debate about the North versus South and the role of slavery in the founding of our country, we don't have a problem accepting that slavery played a role in the Civil War. We can argue whether it was the reason or not. I had someone argue to me one time that it was the hat tax in South Carolina that caused the Civil War. But we all know that. The myth is so politically enforced in Texas, down to what seventh graders are taught, that
It has been for 130 years.
that it's like it's state law that we teach that George Washington really did cut down the cherry tree. It's absurd. And it should be a state as economically sophisticated and demographically diverse as Texas should be strong enough to have an honest discussion of its own history.
To not be scared of a few new ideas.
In this case, very
I'm sorry,
old ones.
I don't get angry about a lot. I consider myself a really chill guy. But when people start enforcing what has to be taught to history students, and it drives me batshit. It's just intellectually, it is cowardly. What are you people afraid of? I'm sorry. I'll get on my little bicycle and ride around and be angry.
Well, and I think, here in Texas, a lot of Texans, whether you were native Texan or you got here as fast as you could, we take a lot of pride in knowing our Texas history. We believe that, yes, the kids need 2 years of Texas history, right? And yet, exactly what you're talking about of not giving us that full, completely honest version means that we then go out into the world with an understanding of our state that's a little bit skewed. And, one of the things that really struck me was a sentence in that same section about slavery in which you write, the Texas Constitution remains the only one in world history to guarantee slavery and actually outlaw any and all emancipation. And that was certainly not taught in my 7th grade Texas history class.
Well, and it certainly couldn't be taught now because of state law making it impossible to teach current events or history or social issues in a way that would make anyone feel uncomfortable because of the color of their skin, which one of the authors of that law said really was about white kids feeling uncomfortable. This history, as it has been taught for more than 100 years in Texas, has always made brown-skinned kids feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. That was one. I hope we can get into a little bit of that later. That's the most important thing in this book, because I went into this book thinking, oh, here's some historical curiosities we can correct. Here's some fun myths that we're correct. And we got about a third of the way through and we started talking with Tejanos, especially those of a certain age. And we realized, shit, this matters. I mean, this story has been used to beat people over the head, to haze them. I don't use the word oppression easily, to oppress them for a long, long time. And this is my 7th book. In the first 6, I wrote about business for a long time. Sorry, that probably puts you to sleep. And when I got a compliment, it was people would come and say, that was a great story, or I learned something from that book. This is the first book I've ever had, maybe for you, where people are coming up and says, this book is meaningful to me, or, this changed the way I'm viewing my history. And that's kind of cool.
Let me give you guys some perspective here. I know he's coming across like a Bernie Sanders voter here. He voted for Mitt Romney. No one is more shocked. Actually, the 2 people more shocked about Bryan's transformation into a culture warrior are his sons, Dane and Griff. They cannot believe that he is talking like this. This is still a shock to me.
Even old dogs can change. Yes.
Okay, so one of the things that you do beautifully throughout the book is you kind of go through these different myths and reveal other truths about them. So I wanted to ask you, I think the thing that a lot of us associate with the Alamo are kind of these 3 guys, Bowie, Travis, and Crockett. So about them, which of those folks maybe most surprised you when you found out more about them? And what do you hope that people will now know about them from this book?
Everyone knows that Travis is perhaps history's greatest war correspondent. You know, he wrote some great letters. I didn't know he was such a preening weenie. He was a 25-year-old boy who just wanted to be in charge of something. I couldn't believe it when I was reading Bryan's section. Like he was begging them to put him in charge of something. So they gave him the cavalry, except no one would join it. So he was riding around on a horse alone. He was a cavalry of a dude.
Yeah. The Crockett stuff, I think anybody who's read anything about Crockett, we don't have a heck of a lot new to say. And yet, if you haven't read it all, it's still surprising to find that he was this overweight former somebody who was coming to Texas in an effort to try to be a somebody again. There's nothing Crockett did that was anything untoward or uncivil or certainly criminal. He was just a guy who was kind of past his prime and very much like Sam Houston looking for a new start. Bowie was the one that stopped to me. You know, I had read some of this stuff about Bowie back in the 90s. We present the 90s as kind of the golden era of Alamo revisionism. That's when a lot of these things first started popping up. And I can't remember what all I knew going in, but it was, you know, I guess people kind of knew he had been a trader in illegal slaves, that is African slaves brought in through Cuba when it was illegal to do so. But in Three Roads to the Alamo in '98 really opened my eyes to the idea of this massive land conspiracy leading to a federal investigation that in Louisiana and Arkansas that he ran from. That's why he came to Texas. And then he basically married a rich guy's daughter and, you know, sucked at that teat. I mean, look, the best you can say about Bowie is he was a hell of a fighter. And as a politician, as an investor, as a businessman, he was a hell of a fighter. That's the one thing you can say about the man. But as in terms of the three of them, he was the one most likely to be brought up on criminal charges, clearly.
Yeah, and his connections with slavery and slave selling just really appalling.
That kind of shocking. Fannin, James Fannin at Goliad was also a trader in illegal slaves through Cuba. There was a certain amount of that through Galveston, so that's one way that these early Texians made money.
Yeah, it took a lot for Jim Bowie to figure out how to break the law while trading slaves when it was really legal back then.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, I want to bring Tejanos into the story now. Okay, so Stephen F. Austin, he comes, he's bringing these colonists. He makes friends with some Tejanos initially, and then there's a big switch. But you know what? I see Chris is walking up to the stage, so maybe we should.
And Chris knows more about the Tejanos than all of us. You walked right into the first Tejano question.
Okay.
It's never
welcome.
taken me 3 hours to drive from Austin before. My apologies to everyone. I feel horrible. So just no excuses. I apologize.
Welcome. So you came just in time for a brand new question. So I wanted to bring Tejanos into the story. When Stephen F. Austin arrives, he's got some colonists with him. He starts making friends with some powerful Tejanos, some influential Tejanos. Over the course of the years, though, as Mexico's perspective on the settlement shifts, his relationship with Tejanos also kind of shifts. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Sure. I mean, he was originally, I think, completely bought into the idea of becoming a Mexican citizen and settling in Mexico. I don't think his intent from the beginning was to fight a war of secession. But, you know, he also was a land developer. And the way to develop land was to kind of make friends with the locals and gentrify the place. And that's essentially what happened. I mean, he was very close to the Seguins. His diary says he learned his Spanish from Juan, and Juan learned his English from Stephen. But as time passed and the money built up, and more of the rednecks from Alabama moved in, his alliances shifted. He tried to manage that probably longer than most. But, by 1835, I think it was pretty clear that where things were headed, and he chose to go with the Anglos.
I mean, up through the Revolution, while the Anglos, the Texians, clearly betrayed the Tejanos, who were their key allies. I'm not sure that Austin's colony could have existed much. Certainly, it wouldn't have thrived without the help of the Tejanos, who were largely centered around San Antonio and Goliad. And many of them, not all of them, allied with the Texians, fought alongside them, Seguin most famously. And by the end of the Revolution, I think that the Tejanos were, had been fighting against the government, not for independence. However, you don't get the sense that, they were just crushed, that they now woke up in an independent country. But before long, they were. The real evils of the revolution occur after the revolution. As you know, as Chris has written, it basically what happened in the years in this area and South, in the years after the revolution, amounted to an ethnic cleansing. Seguin and many others were just run out of San Antonio, out of South Texas. Their land, their livestock, either burned or taken by incoming Anglos, and also for purposes of our discussion, they were not only pushed out of the land, they were pushed out of history, and it took a long time, well into the 20th century, before efforts largely by Tejano historians, the first ones really, other than Castañeda, really came out in the 60s. If for about 40 years, you'd be hard pressed to know that the Tejanos did anything in early Texas other than, do a little scouting and a little cattle raising. Anything else?
I think no.
Okay, I want to actually get into the battle now. So at the battle, we've got some Tejanos, we've got, of course, the Texians, and you kind of revealed to us that maybe the battle wasn't quite the, movies are never truly correct, right? But it's not quite that Hollywood version of these heroes, right? So what really happened at the battle?
Well, the battle should have never been fought, right? It was a bad idea. Houston had ordered Bowie and Travis both to abandon the Alamo. He knew it was indefensible, and frankly, he was happy to draw the Anglo line at the Colorado. He didn't see much use in trying to capture anything south of that. But Bowie and Travis decided to stay. Juan Seguin's scouts warned them, said their Mexican army is on its way. And because they had brown skin, Travis chose not to believe them. He had a very low opinion of Tejanos, including Seguin. He treated them with absolute disrespect. And so he was, I guess, genuinely surprised when the Mexican army, he saw that for himself from the cathedral tower, that the Mexican army had arrived. And by that point, it was too late. There was no tactical or even strategic decision made to stay at the Alamo. They had nowhere to go. They didn't have any horses. Hell, they pawned all their weapons. Famously, the Texians were running through the streets trying to take back the guns they had traded for liquor and food. And they barely hold themselves up inside the Alamo in time for when the Mexican army first arrived. So there was no decision to slow the Mexican army. They were trapped. They were surrounded, and they had nowhere to go. The Mexican cavalry would have cut them down in the fields if they tried to make a run for it. Santa Anna basically made a game out of shooting the walls full of cannonballs for the next 13 days because he was waiting for another division to show up. There was no slowing down of the Mexican army. There was no slowing down of the advance. When the battle finally took place, it lasted a grand total of 45 minutes, and at least half of the Mexican dead were the result of friendly fire because they didn't build their ladders properly, their scaling ladders to come over the walls. And the Mexican officers' reports back to Mexico City they were just astounded, and they couldn't understand why Santa Anna had not waited for that other division to arrive with a heavier cannon. 2/3 of the men inside the Alamo made a run for it, and why wouldn't they? They knew as well as everyone that trying to defend a fortress like that was suicide. Their only chance was to get out in the open and try to maneuver around the cavalry, even if that was a slim one. So, there was no glory here. There was no decision to fight to the death. There was no line in the sand. That was a myth made up 50 years after the battle took place. It was bad leadership, bad tactics, and bad choices, especially since Travis tried to surrender twice. So
If the myth is that these brave Texians came to San Antonio, came to the Alamo to voluntarily make this stand against freedom and oppression, to buy time for Sam Houston, every clause of that sentence is incorrect. First off, they weren't fighting for freedom, which they had, and there's no evidence in the historical record that they were undergoing any oppression other than, they got angry that the Mexicans wanted them to actually pay taxes.
And by the way, Texas did not declare independence until the siege was underway, and the people inside the Alamo had no idea. And the Tejanos, by the way, were not fighting for independence. They were there to fight to overthrow Santa Anna to restore the Mexican Constitution. I think if they'd gotten an email saying, hey, the white folk have decided to join the United States, the Tejanos may have just picked up and went and joined the Mexican army. I mean, we don't know because they didn't know.
But you make the really good point, and this is what so many, I think, people miss, is that the Texian decision to fight at the Alamo was not voluntary. They got stuck. They got trapped. And yes, did they fight to the last man? Presumably bravely.
Down to the last 7.
Because they had no choice. Santa Anna wanted every last one of them killed. And inevitably, that's pretty much what happened.
Well, Davy Crockett surrenders, tries to convince the Mexican officers that he's just a naturalist who accidentally wandered into the Alamo at the wrong time. And then Santa Anna orders him executed. And we've got that from a Mexican officer who witnessed it all. Who, by the way, the Mexican officer was horrified by the execution. So he was no friend of Santa Anna's. But yeah, Crockett did not die swinging old Betsy over his head.
To be fair, though, he said every clause is wrong. It did happen in San Antonio. That was true.
We checked.
I
By the way, can I just ask a quick question? Has anybody been to the Alamo Library in the last 3 months? We're dying to see if they're going to sell the book. I'm serious. They've sold some other vaguely critical books. Sorry for interrupting.
I very much enjoyed the section in which you kind of unpack Santa Anna, because I think for many of us, Santa Anna is just this very one-dimensional evil guy, right? And you kind of explain, he'd been around for a long time. He started as a soldier when he was a teenager, and he goes through a whole evolution. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Do you want it?
Yeah, I guess that's me. I always felt like we all wanted to write more about Santa Anna. And we, the little thing that we never tell people except in public stages, that we had to cut the book by a third at the end because it was so freaking long. We clearly fell in love with the material, and we did cut Santa Anna at the end. Look, it is very clear if you go back and read Santa Anna's biographers that the man was not a dictator at the time. He was probably, not the nicest fellow you'd ever want to meet, but he was above all a skilled Mexican politician, diplomat, and above all soldier. He was alert to the winds of change during the period when he was in the presidency, and was particularly solicitous of the church, of the military. He was not a man who could just look around and tell everybody what he wanted to do at that time. He had to build, he was, from the Criollo elite. He was probably Mexico's best soldier. But I think for our purposes in this brief time that we discuss it, what's most important to understand about Santa Anna is that he was the president of a country who realized that people he had invited into his country were now revolting, shooting his soldiers and stealing the land they had been allowed to farm. And I don't know how you get around that there's anything other than this was, by international law, an illegal revolt. And Santa Anna was horrified at the idea that these Anglos were going to basically come in and attempt to steal Mexico's largest province, which is exactly what was happening. And I'd say I give you credit because I was softer and you were like, they're freaking stealing it, write it harder. And we did.
Well, I mean, he was a Napoleonic soldier. When he calls himself the Napoleon of the West, he wasn't far off. I mean, all of his training was in Napoleonic warfare. And according to international law at the time, if a bunch of guys ride in and try to steal land from a country, they're called pirates. And piracy was punishable by immediate execution, whether that was at sea when pirates were captured by the British Navy, or if it was in northern Mexico, what we now call Texas. So this idea that he was going to execute them, he was executing them as criminals, not because they were soldiers. And that's a distinction that, of course, we don't learn.
Okay, but then he makes some tactical errors and he loses the fight at San Jacinto. And but even leading up to that, after the Battle of the Alamo, Santa Anna's army is on the move, and this story starts getting circulated about what happened at the Alamo. And you describe this as being kind of the beginning of the myth. Can you just tell us, like, what are the stories being spread, and then what are the consequences of that?
That's you.
Within 48 hours of Sam Houston discovering that the Alamo had fallen, he knew he was in deep, deep trouble. Automatically, the runaway scrape begins, and all the Anglos are like, oh, my goodness, Santa Anna's coming. He sent Susanna Dickinson and Travis's slave Joe ahead to say, everyone at the Alamo is dead, and so will you if you're here when I get here, if you're still there when I get there. So the runaway scrape begins. His volunteers from the United States are beginning to run for the border themselves. And Houston goes, okay, well, I got to do something. So he thinks Thermopylae, Spartans. Within 72 hours of Houston discovering the Alamo has fallen, the propaganda rag, the Texas Telegraph, starts publishing the story that these were the Spartans of Texas, and they fought at the Alamo the way the Spartans fought at Thermopylae. They sacrificed themselves so others may live, and we have to honor their sacrifice by fighting back ourselves. It's a story as old as the Bible. It is a mythology that has motivated troops for millennia. And Houston knows this. It's one of the most brilliant psychological warfare operations I've ever witnessed, because once it gets to a telegraph station, this spreads all over the United States. And now more volunteers are coming. His men are rallied. He's got to get them trained. And so he's stalling. But that's when the myth really begins. And it was a pure psyop.
Yeah, it's the reason we talk about the Alamo today is not because of what happened in San Antonio. It's what happened at San Jacinto. If they had not used the story of the Alamo, of the Thermopylae of the West, to win at San Jacinto, charging across that field that day yelling, "Remember Goliad," nobody, which very few people remember, ironically, but remember the Alamo. That's why we remember it today. We ask in the book a question I'm not sure I've ever actually thought about the answer to, which was, if the Texans had lost at San Jacinto and Texas history became a very different thing, would we be here today talking about the Alamo? Some 45-minute skirmish in, would it have mattered? I'm not sure.
Also, I think the subtext of the myth is important for the real tactical value of the Battle of the Alamo. We're all taught that the tactical battle of the Alamo is they bought time for Sam Houston to raise an army, which is hogwash. He didn't have an army after the Alamo. It's not that he wasn't trying to get people to fight, it's that they didn't care. They thought they could sit it out. After the Alamo, they thought, he's going to kill us if we don't beat him. It was a great recruiting tool. And so when you're doing this Thermopylae stuff, and remember the Alamo, it's all, or he's going to kill you if you don't get a gun and join. So that's what I wish they would teach about the Battle of the Alamo, is it convinced all the Texians, you're in this fight, whether you like it or not.
You either left the state, the province. Yeah. If you stayed, you basically had to fight like you were fighting to death, because the assumption was Santa Anna, if you were white male, you were going to be executed.
Yeah.
Okay, so this myth emerges pretty immediately after the Alamo. It motivates a lot of people because of this. This power of we're under attack, our freedom is at stake, right? And yet, and I'm fast forwarding here because I know we're running out of time and I want to leave time for audience questions. Fast forward, 1886. It is the anniversary of the Battle of the Alamo, and there's no celebration. So how did we go from this, sort of motivating myth to,
Well, there was a song. They did sing a song.
That was pretty much it.
Part of it, they're coming out of the Civil War, and then there was an economic depression, and the Texas chauvinism hadn't really taken root yet. And so it wasn't a thing. They remember the Alamo is a revenge myth. Once you get revenge, okay, you're done.
Yeah, but at the 50th anniversary, you're right. The San Antonio paper was like, hey, anybody remember the Alamo? And people kind of gave lip service, but you're exactly right. There was the Civil War. There was Indian wars. There was people.
There was a depression. There was an economic depression at the time.
People remember history and appreciate their history when they had the time to do so. And by and large, in those 50 years, Texans didn't have time to do so.
Okay. But then we do have the entrance of Adina de Zavala and Clara Driscoll. If could you just speak a little bit about what were they trying to reclaim and getting active and talking about the Alamo?
I'm going to be very quick, so because I know we're running out of time. But here was this kind of schoolmarm, Adina de Zavala, who is convinced that she should have higher status, that because of who her grandfather was, the first vice president of Texas. Her family had been victimized by the Anglos during the ethnic cleansing, and she was still in court trying to get her family's land grants back that had been illegally taken away from her. And she became obsessed with the history, and she wanted to restore all the missions in San Antonio, but particularly the Alamo, which had become basically a grocery store and a whiskey house. And they were just storing whiskey in the church, and they were selling groceries in the other part. And she just thought that was horrible. So she wanted to restore it to 1836. Then you have Clara, who's 18 years old or 19 years old. Her mom, she's just buried her mom because they just got back from India and Europe, where she had done the grand tour. And she'd done the grand tour in India, and she'd seen all these beautiful monuments. And she goes, why don't we have that here? And she looks at the chapel and goes, that's it. That's what we need. That's going to be our big park. That's going to be our big sacred spot, the way the Taj Mahal is in India. One wants a park. The other one wants to preserve a mission. Their alliance lasts just long enough until they get control of it, and then they turn on each other. But it is important to say that women at the time did not have the vote, they had no role in politics, and that these memorial organizations, these heritage organizations, was where they derived their political power, their social power. And so there was also a very intense political side of this, as Clara went on to become probably the most powerful woman in Texas up until her death in 1945.
And we argue in the book that this matters because the legacy of these two women as they fought this fight in the early 20th century is that Adina was very much in favor of what we would today call historical accuracy. She wanted to return the Alamo to the way it was. And Clara Driscoll, who was probably the wealthiest woman in Texas at times and perhaps the most powerful, wanted a beautiful park, wanted to enshrine what we call the Anglo-centric legend of Texas. She wanted the heroic Alamo. And the Alamo that we have today, or the Alamo that lasted until, let's say, the 1990s, was almost exclusively Clara's Alamo. It was the Alamo of legend. And in the back of the book, which is almost the back third of the book, which is Jason's third, or what you did the lion's share of the lifting on, we tell the story about how how that all began to change over the last 30 years.
So let me sum it up. Clara would have been concerned about the gift shop. Adina would have knocked off the Taco Bell awning.
Right. Yes. Okay. So what happens is that the Clara Driscoll version kind of wins the day. The DRT, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, then are the stewards of the Alamo for decades, and then recently, in recent times, there start to be some questions about, is the DRT the best steward? And then there's actually a sort of I don't know what you want to call it, government takeover or something, I don't know. But that brings us to this point that we're still at now of talking about an overhaul of the experience that you have when you go to visit the Alamo. And it has created all kinds of controversy. And part of that has to do with the fact that I think that area has become so connected to the idea of public protest. I think it's like this open space for things like that. And that idea of being able to control a narrative, of course, is an age-old issue. But can you just talk to us about, okay, DRT's out. We don't exactly know what's happening now, but what are the competing forces?
Well, let me go back a little bit. It's always been a space for public protest. I mean, it's been a space for Chicano protests. It's been a space, KKK's been there. But the last public protest that was sanctioned on the Alamo grounds was a gun rights rally because Jerry Patterson was land commissioner. For a long time, the DRT, they were given a state law gave them control over the Alamo, and they acted like they owned it. So people would come and talk about refurbishing the state property part of it and the city part of it. And a couple of things would happen. The DRT would say, go away, we're in charge. We don't want you're an outsider. And the city largely wouldn't care. The city didn't have any real motivation to try to further the myth. I think Bill Thornton, when he was mayor, he tried to bring it up and couldn't find any support for it, partly because a lot of the Hispanics in town weren't interested in the Alamo. That was white people's history. And partly because they didn't have enough money to do it, because the chapel and the Long Barrack is state property, the plaza, the streets in front of it are city property. And so the city doesn't have the state's kind of money to do it, and the state's cheap. It was only when Phil Collins gave his collection, the world's largest memorabilia collection of the Alamo, to Jerry Patterson, that we were on the clock for actually doing the big project that a city and state group, the Alamo Master Plan Committee, to fulfill that mission. Couple of things. So the state bought the tourist traps, and so they were going to redo it as much as possible to build it around this whole collection. In the course of researching this book, Brian and Chris found out that the provenance of many of those items is in doubt, and they can talk about that later. But it was very, very close. During the course of writing this book, it was weird to write about the events as they were changing. Writing about a book, the book starts in 1820 and it ended for me the week before I turned it in. And there was a time when Dan Patrick was all for teaching the 300 years of history. He was all for it. He had toured George P. Bush's plans and had little nits here and there, but generally he was for it. And then George P. started talking about running for lieutenant governor. Then suddenly he's horrible at it, and Dan Patrick calls for an audit. They were that close. If George P. had kept his mouth shut for just a second, but he didn't. So now that just relitigated the whole fight that they had worked so long to do. But to sum up, you talked about all the different players. Bryan was the first to point this out. This is basically our Western Wall. This is Jerusalem, because everyone has claim to the land and under the land. The state, as I said, owns what we all think of as the Alamo. The city owns the roads. The state now owns the tourist traps. And the indigenous tribes are buried underneath. It's the only front yard of a mission in San Antonio that is not an official cemetery, because it would cost people too much money to do that. There are a lot of people with claim. And Lee Spencer White, who heads up the Descendants Association, they think they have claims on the land because their DNA is there too. So there are a lot of people with claims on that land.
And Mexican soldier DNA.
Mexico, though, is not asserting any privilege.
Well, I want to make sure we have some time for audience questions. So do we have any audience questions? I see one right over here. Do you want to stand up and try to project in the red hat? In the red hat, yeah, thank you.
We can hear you. We can hear you. We can repeat the question.
Okay. My mind is swirling, but I was taught the very superficial Texas history when I was in 7th grade. So
you mentioned the three main Anglo characters, which are Crockett, Bowie, and Travis. You also mentioned Travis was 25 years old. He left Arkansas,
Alabama.
Alabama.
He's a cousin of mine.
Okay.
They're not close.
Oh, a poor relation. And he left his wife, who was pregnant,
Right.
and his 2-year-old daughter or 2-year-old child in disgrace. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Debts. He had a lot of
And
debts.
debts. So
a
basically,
lot of the people who came to Texas in those days were running away from bad debts.
right.
Yeah, debts and syphilis.
And James Bowie, you mentioned he married a prominent family. It wasn't just a prominent family; it was the Vetamendis
Yeah,
here.
it was kind of
And
the family along
The
with the Skeens.
family, yes. And his wife and daughter died because they went to Mexico and they died of cholera.
Yes.
Okay.
Some accounts doubt that there was actually a daughter. Some say there was. It's kind of up in the air.
Then that brings us to Crockett, and actually all three. These were, you outlined, very unsavory characters, to say the least. They crossed rivers, the Sabine or the Red River, to get to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have documentation?
Bowie did. I don't think Travis did. Crockett definitely did not.
Well, that was one of the points that we had the most fun with a little bit early in the book when we're writing about tensions between the Texans and the central government circa 1830, was that the biggest problem that the Mexican government had was that there were too many Americans coming in. They were going to overwhelm Texas. And so they were trying to do everything they can, get this, the Mexican government, to keep Americans from coming across the river into Mexico. I mean, the irony, that was missing as we write,
irony.
all that was missing was Santa Anna trying to build a border wall.
Right. I guess that was one of the points I was trying to make, is the irony that we don't get, our children even now do not get taught these very important details. It's all very superficially taught in 7th grade. And I go back to my 7th grade teachings of the Alamo. And it wasn't until I became, 30 or 40, I'm now in my 70s, but that I had to research myself what was happening in the Alamo. And the more research that I did, the angrier I got. at how I felt I was cheated as a Hispanic, as a Mexican American about my history. And my family on my mother's side has been in this part of Texas since 1750.
Wow.
On my father's side, about 10,000 years. So I'm glad that you wrote this book, and I'm glad it was written by Anglos, because I think if Hispanics had written it or Mexican Americans had written it, it probably would not be getting quite the attention that it's getting now, even though Patrick, or one of the two Ps, cut off your presentation in Austin. But I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that the book was written.
Gracias.
Thank you. You're very kind. I will say that we were keenly aware, especially as the book went on and we were writing more and more about Tejanos, that 3 aging Anglo journalists from Austin were not the ideal messengers for this. But then we were like, nobody else is saying this, so what are we going to do? Get in trouble? And I will say that your message of kind of outrage that you weren't taught, that you've had to learn this on your own. The 2 most common things that we hear from people who like the book, let's see if you guys agree, are people who say, I am outraged. I can't believe I was taught this lie. And then the people who are like, and many of them Mexican American, who say, I've been telling people this for years and they just roll their eyes at me.
Let me add to that. I want to disagree a little bit. It wasn't that no one else was saying it. Our book is mostly that Hispanics have been saying this for years. White people screwed this history up. It's not up to y'all to fix it. That's our job.
Well, I have never been more proud to be an alumni of Travis Elementary School. Thank you.
What was your mascot?
I don't know. A racist. So I heard about your book because of the debacle with the event you tried to have at the Alamo.
At the Bullock State, Texas History Museum.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm curious about is when this book inevitably is written 50 years from now again, and y'all are now part of the story of the myth and how it continues to be held up. I'm curious, what is your framework and how would you tell this story 50 years from now? Like, the way I see it a little bit is government censorship because of the players that were involved with censoring that event. So I'm just curious on what your take is on that. Yeah.
Most of the back half of the book is about events that are exactly what happened to us. People, historians, Hispanics, academics, they know what the history is, and politicians have been shutting it down for more than 100 years. They actually had legislative hearings about what is taught at the University of Texas a long time ago.
1898.
1883. It was 1890.
1800s. But when I think about how the book 50 years from now is going to do this, I'm more concerned about who plays me in the movie.
Good luck.
Your book makes a reference to illegal American immigrants that were crossing the border or the river, coming to take over cheap land and bring their slaves or their cattle and so on. Is there any indication what percentage of these crossings, Texians or American citizens that were coming here, were legal, and what percentage of them? Because some of the Americans were welcome to come because Mexico was trying to populate the northern part. But what percentage were illegal? Were coming without any invitation and crossing the river illegally?
So in 1834, Juan Almonte, who would go on to be, who was a Mexican officer who would become Santana's chief of staff. He was also the defense attaché for the Mexican government in Washington, D.C. when this battle broke. He estimated between 30 and 40% of the Americans who he saw when he toured that part of Texas in 1834 had crossed without authorization. it was actually a very complex, complicated system of getting your legal land permit. And it had to be done through the impresario and through the local Mexican officials. But when he was touring around, visiting different farms and ranches and seeing what was up, he figured 30 to 40% had crossed illegally, were holding on to land illegally. And he was the one who called for a division of the Mexican army to be stationed along the Sabine to stop the transition. He says, in 1834, he says, the Americans are trying to steal Texas. If we don't put a division of troops on the Sabine River, we're going to lose Texas forever. And he was quite prescient.
Hi, my name is Matthew Garza. It feels really divine that this talk is happening. I grew up in Corpus Christi, fellow angry Tejano, but I currently live in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm the co-founder of the House of Glitter Dance Company. We've been, for the past 2 years, doing a residency with the City Parks Department, living in the former home of Isaac Hopkins, who was commander of the slave ship Sally. And so we've been doing a lot of work about thinking about how to, using arts and community work to support municipalities, parks departments, the owners and custodians of these historic spaces to, shift the energetic center of space and reinterpret the memorial, so to speak. So I'm curious, kind of two-part question. How has writing this book impacted the way you move through the world? And at your dinner table, with your colleagues, with your family, with your friends, just being a citizen, how has it impacted you personally? And what insight do you think this text has for how we navigate as a society moving forward?
I wonder if I'm the one that had the most profound change. I mean, all our politics are personal. I don't want to get into it, but it definitely, I guess, took me from being right of center politically to left of center. And it certainly made me, let's just say, much more aware of the things I should have been aware of before.
It made me much more keenly aware that I am fundamentally a visitor here. I used to feel like I was a visitor because I was born elsewhere and I moved here when I was 23. And it made me much more keenly aware of how the Hispanics who have been around me all this time have been second-class citizens, and why, and how we got there. And that my wife majored in sociology, and she says the horrible thing about sociology is once you see something, you can't unsee it. So once you see that, it's sort of like there was slavery, but no one told you. We all know why our Black population in the United States has struggles. It's because they started out enslaved, and that's historical fact that everyone knows. I never knew that really. I actually didn't even know it at all about Hispanics in Texas, and that was a real eye opener. And so I started studying Spanish because it's just embarrassing. I can't speak the native language here.
I mean, my other book is Tomlinson Hill, which is about my family's settling of a slave plantation up on the Brazos outside of Waco. And that was my first reckoning. But I was a foreign correspondent. I covered the end of apartheid in South Africa. I covered the genocide in Rwanda, ethnic violence in Somalia. And so when I came home from that, I confronted my own family's history of ethnic violence. And while I still, as a fifth generation Texan, consider myself a Texan, what it means to be a Texan will never be the same for me. And studying, going back, my family came here in 1849, going back 40 years and looking at those 40 years of history have just made me realize how privileged I am and that I should use my privilege for good.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming out for the first in-person San Antonio Book Festival event of 2021, and hope that you can join them again in May for the big event. I do want to remind you that we have books for sale over here from Nowhere Bookshop, and that Bryan, Chris, and Jason will be signing books. Thank you again for coming out.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you. Sorry for being late.
Just one small change. We're moving book signing over here where it's well lit.